What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. Today, I want to go through and review some potential trades that the Packers could make prior to the trade deadline that could make some sense. We'll get to that in just a moment. I know that's going to be probably a favorite topic because everyone always loves talking trades. We'll go through why it's going to be a little bit more complex. But before we get there, let's go through transactions first. So Packers picked up a new practice squad player, Kawaan Baker, wide receiver, 2021 7th round pick from the Saints, good speed, some return ability. So finally getting somebody on the practice squad that at least has some, return ability and, could maybe be used in that position down the line, but more of a burner, not really an agile type of guy. Good RAS score coming out, relative athletic score. So we'll see if he can stick on the practice squad and maybe be somebody that they call up, down the road. Wouldn't get your hopes up too high, but he is the newest Green Bay Packer. Again, Kawaan Baker on the practice squad. That was the only transaction, but we did get some injury notes as well. There were 4 players in total who did not practice: Randall Cobb, Jake Hansen, Aaron Rodgers, and Christian Watson. Cobb and Hansen were expected. Aaron Rodgers, not necessarily expected, but understandable. There was no concern. It sounds like he's going to practice the remainder of the week and, of course, play this weekend. So no cause for panic there. Christian Watson, definitely still a bummer that he is, not back and practicing in some capacity. But this is one where I'm assuming they're going to be a bit more cautious. There's still an opportunity he could potentially go on IR. Maybe they just set him out for a few weeks. We'll have to see what approach they take, but he was not practicing on Wednesday. Sammy Watkins was, basically designated for return. No imminent, I guess there's a possibility he could play this weekend, but no imminent, return just yet. Matt LaFleur basically said there's nobody yet that's just penciling him in for this weekend. So I would guess that Watkins does not play this weekend based on LaFleur's comments, but we're just going to have to sort of take it 1 week at a time. All right, so let's get into our main topic right away, and that is some potential trade targets for the Packers as we get into trade season. Trade deadline is after week 8, so still a couple weeks away. But I think there's a few things that we need to go over here before we can start defining some potential trades and targets. I think the first thing we need to define is, what is it exactly that Green Bay needs? All right, well, I think it's very clear if they could get a playmaker on the outside, somebody who can, challenge deep, be a deep threat, hopefully win some of those one-on-one matchups, or just let's be real, just a very good playmaker in some capacity, whether that's at wide receiver or tight end, would probably need to be one of those. Somebody who could stretch the field as a tight end in the middle of the field, hit the seam. I think there's opportunity there. So I think that would be 1A. I think offensive line, you can certainly look as well. Probably an offensive tackle. If you could find a solid, right tackle that could allow you to move Elton Jenkins back inside, still allow Yash to be depth at left tackle for Bakhtiari, and maybe just kind of even things out a little bit. So I think, offensive line, offensive tackle is certainly a possibility. I think they could explore maybe some depth on the defensive side of the ball, specifically at edge rusher, although Enigbari is coming along pretty decently. So, maybe not, but I think that's something that they at least could look at as well, but certainly not on the top of the priority list. I think the next thing we need to look at is, what can Green Bay afford? And this is an interesting one that I think needs a little bit of definition, but I also wouldn't get too bogged down in it. So Green Bay's got about $7.5 million in cap space. Now, they're going to need some money to be able to operate through the remainder of the season. You can't just spend all $7.5 million and then not have anything left. Although there would be ways, if they wanted to, basically trade for a player who's more expensive, you could give additional compensation to the team that you're trading him for to move the base salary into some signing bonus, meaning that the team that trades him away would eat that cap space instead of Green Bay. You'd again have to give up more compensation to do that, but that's an opportunity. You could also acquire him and then, on your own, potentially do the same thing where you would put that cap space into the future by changing it to signing bonus. So there's still ways that they would be able to bring a player on that had a higher cap hit this season, but they'd have to be a little bit careful with how they actually operated and did that, and then probably make some adjustments either prior to the trade or after the trade. So not to get, again, too bogged down in it. I think Green Bay has the ability to, as long as it's not like a $20 million player that, you can't change the salary too much or something like that. They have the ability to kind of go out and get a player that they would want, but they do have some, restrictions in the top end players and who they actually can acquire. But overall, they can afford, I think, the vast majority of players that they would actually want to go out and get. The next thing we have to look at is who's actually looking to trade right now. And if you look around the league, there's just not many teams that are out of it and probably in the sellers market. You look at, who is right now or who could be. The Houston Texans, all right, they just had the big front office change. They could be a team that recognizes, all right, there's no way that they're competing this year. And if they can get some draft picks and start the rebuild, not the rebuild process, clearly they're already rebuilding, but, get more draft picks and get maybe rid of some veteran players, that would be a team that would certainly make some sense. The Washington Commanders, if Green Bay could beat them this weekend, could be a team that quickly realizes, okay, they're not going to be competing. They've got some really good teams already in their division, in Dallas and in Philadelphia, and the Giants. They're clearly the fourth team in the division. They're not really competing for a playoff spot. If they were to beat the Packers this week, now you're just a game below 500, and maybe it makes you not want to sell off. But they could definitely be a team. The Detroit Lions and Chicago Bears, I just, the Lions and the way that Dan Campbell structure set up, I have a hard time believing that Campbell's going to be a guy that ever waves the white flag. Like, they could be like 1-14 and he's going to be telling his team they can still make the playoffs somehow. Like, that's just what it feels like. So, I don't know that they're ever going to be a true seller just because of the connotation that would come along with that. Chicago Bears, like I said, I think they could be, but with both the Lions and the Bears, would they trade in division? That usually is not something that happens. I'll touch base on that more in just a moment. From the Carolina Panthers could be certainly another team. They already fired their head coach. That's the team that's sort of been labeled as the potential sellers. And they need draft picks because they're going to have to acquire a quarterback at some point. They're going to need to be bad. They probably want the number 1 overall pick, or at least number 2, to get one of the top quarterbacks in this draft. So any additional draft compensation that they could get could go a long way in helping them maybe get that quarterback, which is obviously the 1A need for the Panthers right now. So Texans, Commanders, Lions, Bears, Panthers, all of them could be, potential trade partners or sellers at the deadline. The New England Patriots are always willing to trade. It just doesn't seem like it matters if they're 15-1 or on pace for 15-1 or 16-1 or a bad team. If they find a deal that they think makes sense for them, they've always been willing to move players if needed. So they're always sort of open for business. The Steelers are a tough one. I think that could be a team with maybe a couple more losses that really becomes a seller. But again, sort of in the same Dan Campbell vein, Mike Tomlin, that's just not his style, right? He's going to continue to want to push to play and try to get as many wins as possible. The Jaguars could be another one. Although, again, this is a young team and this is a team that needs to get some wins. And just a few weeks ago, they looked like they were actually going to be competitive. The AFC South, not great, right? The Texans, the Titans, the Colts, that's an awful division. If the Jaguars get a couple wins, all of a sudden, they're no longer in the interest of trading players away. So maybe with a couple losses for Steelers and Jacksonville, they could get in that conversation, but I'm not sure they're there right now. So you just have very limited teams that I think would be willing to maybe do that type of deal. And that's in a selling instance. You could always look for a player for player trade that would help both teams. And with so many teams that are competing, maybe we could see a couple of those, but those are so rare. We just don't see very many player for player trades in the NFL. You could look for a trade where, you have a strength and the opposing team has a weakness, and you have a weakness and the opposing team has a strength, and you just have sort of a swap of strength for weakness. And that's usually, again, a player for player trade. Well, obviously a player for player trade. And again, those just don't happen very often, but Green Bay could certainly take a look at something that might work in that extent as well. So all of those things are at play. As mentioned, the trade deadline is after week 8. So what happens in the next couple of weeks to some of those teams, Jacksonville, Pittsburgh, New England, maybe the Commanders, maybe the Lions. I think all of those things could be in play. And if any of those teams lose a couple more games, maybe they become much more aggressive sellers at the deadline. But if any of those win a couple games in these, next 2 weeks, that could change the prerogative as well. But it also is worth mentioning that this Washington game probably is a huge deciding factor in if the Packers are actually buyers or not. Because if Green Bay loses to Washington and then loses to Buffalo on the road, they will be 3-5. And while that's not completely out of the realm of possibility. Is Brian Gutekunst really going to want to put a first round pick or some major picks in the deal when that could actually end up being a good pick if your team doesn't turn it around? Like, I'm just not sure they're going to want to pump a bunch of resources into this team if it just doesn't look like they ultimately have a chance at winning a Super Bowl. They may live to see another day and say, hey, we need to make some major changes this offseason, or if Rodgers retires, they're going to have to do a main rebuild. So I'm just not so certain that certainly if they lose to Washington this week, that, Green Bay's even in the buying conversation. So these next 2 weeks, very much going to be a deciding factor. A, if Green Bay buys, and then B, who could potentially be sellers at the deadline as well. So all of those things very much in play. Green Bay has some salary cap limitations, but it shouldn't be too limiting. They have to figure out a trade partner, somebody who's actually willing to sell their, off on their team. And remember, you don't have to look farther back than the Milwaukee Brewers this past trade deadline where, they were humming along and they trade away Josh Hader and all of a sudden they go from first to a non-playoff team. And those trades can have major impacts. So if it's a player for player, like even if you're a contending team, like that can be something that disrupts the locker room, which is why we don't see very many of those trades in the NFL. So as mentioned, it's just going to be hard. That being said, I spent way too much time going through every team and seeing what type of trades could potentially work and some names that I think could make sense. I'm going to go through some that I know are popular names that I don't think are going to make sense as well. But we'll go through some picks for players trades, teams that are maybe looking to sell where Green Bay could buy for draft picks moving forward, some player for player trades, and we'll do some change of scenery trades as well. So I think the one that is probably going to be the most interesting for people is the picks for players, the ones that happen more often, right? So let's start with DJ Moore. That is probably the creme de la creme, like the crown jewel of the potential trade deadline. I want to say up front, I just don't see the Panthers trading him. Now, that being said, as we discussed earlier, the Panthers' goal right now has to be finding a long-term quarterback and making sure that A, they are bad the remainder of this year so that they make sure they're getting one of those top picks, and B, that they have draft capital to trade up should they end up with like the 4th or 5th pick and need to get up in the top, part of that draft. So getting a couple extra first round picks could be extremely valuable for the Panthers. I'm not saying Green Bay should trade 2 first round picks for DJ Moore, but if they could trade DJ Moore for a 1st and a 4th, 1st and a 3rd, something like that, and maybe they can trade another one of those, their top players for a first round pick, that would give them ammunition in this next draft to go and really start a rebuild with a quarterback of their liking, with already having probably a very bad pick and then some picks to go along with it to make them a very valuable trade commodity to getting up in the draft if they need to. But I just don't see Carolina going away from DJ Moore. He is a young, talented player, and I think it's just going to be difficult for them to sort of bite the bullet on that type of player. They'd have to take some dead cap space on. He does fit very well within Green Bay's salary cap. It does make some sense. It sounds like Green Bay has been making calls in regards to potential trade partners for wide receivers. He fits exactly what they need, run after the catch guy. He can win deep. Like it is a perfect fit. There's no question about it. But I just don't see Carolina making that move. And I just don't see Green Bay putting like a 1st and a 3rd, 1st and a 4th out for a wide receiver when if their offensive line doesn't block, it doesn't matter anyway, right? So I don't see that trade happening, but I guarantee you if all of a sudden DJ Moore becomes available, Brian Gutekunst will make a call and they'll see if they can work something out. I just wouldn't hold your breath on that one. Another name that I've seen quite a bit of is Brandon Cooks. Brandon Cooks has a large guarantee on his contract next season, which would make the trade prohibitive for Green Bay. So I do not see a Brandon Cooks trade in the Packers' future. I just think that would be a really tough pill to swallow next season when they're going to have to make some really difficult decisions already. It's like an $18 million guaranteed contract. And there's some things you could do with that to push that down the road so it doesn't all hit next year. But it's not ideal. And I do not see Green Bay taking on that contract, much less the Texans would have a huge cap hit as well. So I just don't see that trade working from either side. So I do not think Brandon Cooks will be a Packer. So don't think DJ Moore, don't think Brandon Cooks. Here are some names that I think we could keep an eye on. I think probably the one that makes the most sense, it doesn't move the needle a ton, but it fits from the team trading him standpoint. It fits from the Packers standpoint, a position of need within the salary cap, and that's Kendrick Bourne for the New England Patriots. Personally, for me, it doesn't move the needle enough. I think they have enough Kendrick Bourne type wide receivers on the roster that I don't think that changes your offense all that much. It doesn't change how a defensive coordinator is going to go against you, but he's a nice player. He could be another piece at wide receiver. I don't know. Like I said, ultimately, am I willing to give any sort of valuable draft pick and take on additional salary for Kendrick Bourne where I don't think it moves the needle that much? I'm not in love with it, but I would understand if Green Bay went in that direction, especially if Cobb and Watkins and Watson struggle to get back and you just need additional wide receivers, then yeah, that deal definitely could make some sense. So that would be the first one. Bourne has not been getting playing time in New England. They have wide receivers ahead of him, so I think there's a good chance that they try to move him at the trade deadline, and it's a position of need for Green Bay. So Kendrick Bourne definitely within the realm of possibility for the Packers. The next one is Chase Claypool. Now, I already talked about the Steelers and not probably wanting to be sellers. One of the things that I think, maybe it's a pick and a player that could potentially help the Steelers a little bit so it doesn't look quite as much as a sell. But I think one of the things that the Steelers could look at with Claypool is it is a position of strength. They do have Deontay Johnson and George Pickens already, and they have Kelvin Austin coming back, a 4th-round pick. And you could make an argument that Johnson, Pickens, and Austin should be a good enough wide receiver core with Freiermuth at tight end. Obviously, a good running back group. So I think that could be enough of at the weapons, overall weapons for them. And they could say, hey, we know how to draft wide receivers. We've done it forever. If we can get a good pick for Claypool, maybe we get a 2nd rounder for him and we can use a 3rd or 4th rounder on a receiver and replace Chase Claypool. Meanwhile, we get a better pick in return and can go get a bigger position of need. So that could be one. Again, it's the Steelers, it's Mike Tomlin. I don't know that they're going to sell, and I don't know that they're going to want just draft picks in return. So could be in play. Don't think it's without, out of the realm of possibility. And I guarantee Green Bay would be interested in Claypool, but I very much question whether or not the Steelers would actually be willing to trade him away. The next 3 all along the offensive line that I think could give Green Bay some help. The first one's my favorite, but there's a little bit of an issue. That's Charles Leno from the Washington Commanders, who Green Bay will see this week. One of the most underrated tackles over the last, 6-7 years. Chicago Bear, Washington Commander, has done nothing but play good football through the entirety of his career. Former 7th-round pick that's just been a really, really good football player. And Washington has a little bit of depth along the offensive line. They're banged up, so that would make it maybe a little bit troublesome for them, and maybe they wouldn't want to do that, especially if they have to go, if they want to get a look at Sam Howell at some point. Maybe they don't go in that direction, but they don't need a 30-plus year offensive lineman. Their window to actually win anything is nowhere near when Charles Leno is going to be able to help them. They could get some draft compensation back in return for him, which can help them start rebuilding this, or build this team up. So this is a deal that I really like for both teams. The caveat is that Leno has played left tackle basically his entire career. And he's had a cup of coffee at right tackle. I'm talking maybe 10 to 12 snaps total in his career at right tackle. So you're getting another left tackle. You already have Bakhtiari and Yash. So you would have to move him to right. And clearly you would need to make sure that he's comfortable with making that switch. Now he's going from a team that's clearly not a contender to a team that's, maybe a contender, I guess. So you're going to a better team, obviously have an opportunity to make the playoffs at least. And, you're improving in that regard. But if he's not comfortable moving to right tackle, or Green Bay's like, hey, we like the idea, but we could trade for him. We could move him to right tackle and he could just be terrible at right tackle because he's never really done it before. You're taking some risk there. I like the move. I think he would fit very well at right tackle. Easy for me to say. It's not Madden. You can't just, go into manage players and move the little slider from left tackle to right tackle. But I do think that could be a move that makes sense. As mentioned, he's just been a really good tackle his entire career, and that would allow you to move Elton inside. And all of a sudden, David Bakhtiari, Elton Jenkins, Josh Myers, John Runyon, Charles Leno, that feels pretty good. So definitely like the idea, but it all hinges upon, can you beat Washington and make them a seller, and you a buyer, and then B is, would he be sufficient at right tackle? So there's definitely some question marks there too. The next one is more of a depth piece, and that's Riley Reef, the backup offensive tackle for the Chicago Bears. So Bears picked up Riley Reef right before the season started as a swing tackle. I think they thought they were going to need him to start, but their other tackles, Bourne and I forget their right tackle off the top of my head. I think it's a rookie. But their two tackles have been sufficient. They haven't had to go to Riley Reef. He's sitting on the roster at $3 million for this season. And you could make an argument they don't need him. They would love to have the cap savings. And, if they could get some draft compensation for him as well, it's just a win-win. And you're not going to spend any major draft resource for Riley Reef. Maybe you trade a bottom of the roster player that Chicago gets a look at. Maybe you trade one of your, recent 7th round picks. It's Tariq Carpenter or I don't know, maybe, I don't know that Toure or Walker would be. Maybe you trade a Jonathan Ford, something like that. Or maybe you just give a future 7th round pick. Who knows? But I do think that could be a deal that makes sense. And you might say, but Andy, why would, Chicago want to trade and help Green Bay? Green Bay and Chicago are in two totally different stratospheres for what both teams are trying to do. And the Bears recognize that they're not competing with Green Bay right now. And quite frankly, they're probably thinking, hey, we'll give Green Bay another veteran offensive tackle. Like, they're probably not going to win anything this year anyway. We pick up some draft capital. And by the time, the Bears are ready to compete, Green Bay will probably have had their window, slammed shut at that point and are going to have to probably do a little bit of a rebuild. So I don't think that the Bears are concerned that they're trading Riley Reef and all of a sudden now Riley Reef's going to be the missing piece for Green Bay. And even for Green Bay, I don't think you necessarily get Riley Reef and he just becomes the right tackle. I think he could become more of a swing tackle and maybe you give him an opportunity at right tackle. But Green Bay's always done in Brian Gutekunst's era a nice job of finding that swing tackle that can come in and provide some depth if you need it, whether it's been Billy Turner, Rick Wagner, Jared Valdir, they've just, Dennis Kelly, they've always had that guy on the roster. They don't have that guy right now. I think that could still be a valuable piece, even if it doesn't move the needle all that much. So late round pick or maybe a younger player that, is blocked on the roster for Riley Reef. I think that trade could make some sense. And then the last one, probably a little bit difficult, but Jack Conklin, the right tackle for the Browns. He's coming back from injury. He's played a couple weeks now. He's looked good, and he's in the last year of his deal. And I don't think he and the Browns are probably going to come to any agreement, which is going to make him a free agent. He has voids on his deal. So the Browns would probably need to lose the next 2 weeks, because I think if they're anywhere near competing and they're going to get, he who shall not be named back at quarterback, I think maybe they're just we'll keep him around, and that could certainly help. But if they lose their next 2 weeks, they could look to sell, understanding that Conklin's not going to be back next year. They've played without him, to start this season, and it went okay. So they could feel like, hey, we can move on from Conklin, get some draft capital in return, and it's not going to hurt us that much. We're not competing this year anyway, and that could make some sense. Meanwhile, if Conklin can get back to where he was playing, prior to injury, like I said, he's already looked good these first couple weeks back. That could be a major get. He has the ability to be one of the better right tackles in the league when he's playing his brand of football. That could really solidify the edges with Bakhtiari and Conklin. Again, you move Elton back to left guard, Myers at center, Runyon at right guard, or even if you want to switch Runyon and Elton, that's fine. That could really, really solidify the offensive line. He had an $8 million cap hit coming into the season. Remember, that would prorate. You could probably just fit him in. You may need to ask Cleveland to maybe put a little bit of signing bonus in there to take a little bit more onus on their end so that Green Bay can fit him in. But that would be another player that could make some sense. I think him coming off of injury would cloud things a little bit. But those are the type of players, and he fits. He is a right tackle. Unlike Leno, who's a left tackle who would have to make the move to right. Conklin's played right tackle his entire career and had experience in Tennessee with Matt LaFleur. So that's one I really like, but the odds of it happening probably very slim. So players that I think could make some sense for picks for players: Kendrick Bourne, Chase Claypool, Charles Leno, Riley Reef, and Jack Conklin. How about some player for player deals? The Seahawks have 3 tight ends. They've got Noah Fant, they've got Colby Parkinson, and Will Dissly. And I don't really care who Seattle would be willing to trade. Parkinson is probably the one that they'd be willing to move on from. He is gets the least snaps of the 3. And I think if Green Bay could find a trade, whether it's maybe they trade a player for Parkinson, again, it's a strength for Seattle. Maybe Green Bay has a player that could be a weak, that's of a weakness for the Seahawks, and you could make a player for player swap there. I think maybe like a Josiah DeGuara and a draft pick for Parkinson could make some sense. Seattle gets DeGuara, who would fit still that number 3 tight end role. They still have Disley and Fant in front of them, so they're not missing anything. And they would get a draft pick in exchange. I think that could make some sense. And meanwhile, Green Bay goes from DeGuara, who hasn't been in the rotation, to a legitimate tight end who would play ahead of Tyler Davis and would probably split snaps with Tonyan. You could use some Tonyan Parkinson, 2 tight end sets. I just think that would maybe open up the offense a little bit. I'm just intrigued. And maybe they would rather give Disley, maybe they would rather give Fant. I don't think that's going to be the case, but they've got 3 good tight ends, and I think any of them would be able to help Green Bay. So maybe, like I said, a DeGuara and a draft pick for Parkinson maybe could make some sense for both teams. And then the other one, I posted this one on Twitter, and I know some people were not a fan of it immediately, and I'll explain. Sometimes it's tough to get everything out in one tweet. But I said, I don't like this trade because you're trading a better player for a worse player, which is never a good thing to do. But the Denver Broncos have a need at left tackle. The Green Bay Packers have a need at right tackle. And to me, there could be some sense, even though I'm not a huge fan of it myself, in some sort of Yosh Nijman for Billy Turner swap. And let me say why I think it could make some sense first, and then I'll go why, even on, I know some of you are probably already disliking the trade, and I don't love it either, but let me go over it in a second. First of all, these are like parameters of deals. All of these deals that I'm talking about are like general parameters. Some teams might need to throw in a pick here or there. In this case, I think the Broncos would have to throw in another player. Maybe like an Albert Obekuwan at tight end. Maybe you trade Yosh for Big O and Billy Turner. You get a tight end who's more of a pure tight end, and you get an offensive tackle. Maybe there's some sort of other trade that you can work. Maybe it's Billy Turner in a 4th, 5th round pick or something for Yosh. Who knows? But I think we're just talking parameters of a deal, like general parameters, right? So in this scenario, Denver gets their left tackle. They can keep Cameron Fleming at right tackle. They get their left tackle in Yosh. It helps them, solidifies their offensive line. Meanwhile, Green Bay very much seems unwilling to put Yosh at right tackle. I would very much try him there first before you make this move. But if they just don't think that can work, and Yosh isn't cool with playing right tackle, and it's just not, it's not where he's going to fit, you probably still got Bakhtiari this year and next year at left tackle before they make any major decisions on him. Billy Turner can always play left tackle in a pinch. It's not his primary position, but he can do it. And in the meantime, you get your right tackle from the last couple seasons back. You pick up probably a draft pick in return as well to compensate you for taking on the worst player. But if Green Bay wants to solidify this offensive line, getting a player like Billy Turner maybe could do that a little bit. Now, I have never been a Billy Turner guy, ever. And I think that's been documented in multiple places before. Even when I think a lot of Packer fans were like, yeah, Billy Turner's really good. I'm like, is he? Haven't been a huge Billy Turner guy. I think I've had the opportunity to interview him. Really cool person. I love the person, and I always always cheering for his success. I hope he's killing it in Denver, but also he's coming off of injury. He's clearly the worst player of the two at this point between Yosh and Billy, which is never a great start to a deal. But again, I know Mike Wall really, was high on Billy and wanted him back, and was, disappointed when he was gone. So maybe you just get that and solidify the right tackle and hope that he can hold up, well enough and move Elton back inside. Like I said, do I love it? I don't, but that could be one of those player for player trades that Yosh knows, Hackett's system, Billy knows Green Bay's system, and you just make the change of scenery swap and try to get the player that can actually help you right now while picking up a draft pick as well. Last but not least, some quick change of scenery trades. How about like a Denzel Mims from the Jets for Sean Ryan? You got a former 2nd round pick in Mims. You got a former 3rd round pick in Ryan. Ryan hasn't really fit in so far. The Jets could use some offensive line depth. Maybe they really liked him in the draft. They're clearly not high on Mims. that could maybe be a change of scenery swap. Maybe you do Sean Ryan and Amari Rodgers for Denzel Mims. Maybe it's more of Rodgers and a pick, or Ryan and a pick for Mims, something in that realm where you get Denzel Mims back. Do I think that's going to change your offense? No, but it could just be a good change of scenery. I know Sean Ryan's a recent third-round pick and hasn't really gotten an opportunity so far. Just get the feeling that Green Bay is not in love with the player that he is right now, not getting activated on game days. He has a long ways to go, and if they want a new wide receiver who has the ability to stretch the field a little bit, maybe they take a flyer on a Denzel Mims. How about Anthony Schwartz from the Browns for like Amari Rodgers and draft picks? I struggle to put Amari Rodgers in any of these deals because I'm not sure if Amari Rodgers gets cut right now that anyone even claims him without giving up a pick. So I don't think he actually has like value. But if you're, making a change of scenery trade, like Anthony Schwartz has struggled in in Cleveland. So like he hasn't exactly been lighting the world on fire either. So maybe you just trade two recent, third-ish round pick wide receivers. I think it may have been a second rounder for Schwartz, at least second or third. And maybe you just swap them, and maybe Green Bay has to probably throw in like a 7th round pick with that as well. But you pick up a speed wide receiver on the outside who could maybe help you stretch the field a little bit. Browns get a little bit of a gadget wide receiver. Maybe something could work there. And then the last one is Albert Obekuwan from the Broncos for Josiah DeGuara. That's another one, change of scenery. Albert O has not been able to get on the field in Denver. Their recent rookie Dulcich just passed him at tight end. And, maybe they don't at least Hackett is familiar with DeGuara. Green Bay does not seem to really want to play DeGuara all that much. And maybe you pick up a tight end that has the ability to actually play pure tight end and maybe stretch the seam a little bit. Albert O, a very big athlete and someone that, Brian Gutekunst would usually be attracted to from an athleticism standpoint. Maybe a change of scenery there for DeGuara and Albert O could be good for both players, and Green Bay gets a tight end that can maybe stretch the seam a little bit. Those are my ideas. I don't love any of them. I'm just going to be honest. It is really difficult to find a team that has a player that would make sense for Green Bay, that Green Bay has the capital needed, both financially and draft capital, to go and get that player that they'd be interested in, that just everything works from all sides. I don't love any of them. I don't think any of these trades, even DJ Moore, maybe moves the needle enough where you're going from like a meh team to like a Super Bowl team. And if you're not moving to a Super Bowl team, is it worth doing some of those deals? I would guess that maybe Green Bay makes a small move. Maybe that's a free agent signing. Maybe that's a who knows? Maybe it's a small 7th round pick for a flyer. Maybe it's one of the players I mentioned. It's probably not, but that's where I think Green Bay is probably headed right now. Like I said, I think this is going to be a rather dry trade deadline. Usually they are, but I think this one could even be drier than normal just because like you have so many teams that are competing, and if you're competing, it's really tough to trade players away. And as the Brewers just demonstrated, not always recommended to do anything like that. So that's going to do it for me today. Thank you so much for joining me. Let me know if you thought of any trades that you think could work. Would love to hear your ideas. So I will be checking the comments below. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. I'll be right back here tomorrow with an all new episode with Mike Wall. So make sure to, again, check that out and subscribe. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.